We've been talking about the parasha this week and the link between the parasha and the Haftarah, and how it is that we see from the Haftarah an insight into the parasha that we might have missed, because the Haftarah is specifically the Shiras Devorah, a song attributed to a woman, and that gives us an insight that the parasha, even though we call it Shabbos Shira and we know that this is a Shabbos that is associated with song, we usually always think that it's the song of Moshe and the men, but actually the Haftarah tells us there's something about the song of the women that is deeper and more profound than the song of the men. What is that? So effectively we said that the principle works as follows. It's all relative. So depending on how hard it was for a person to go through the difficult times, relative to that will be the extent of celebration that they have when things turn around and when things are good again. So because the women had a much, much more difficult time in Egypt than the men did, as we discovered yesterday, because while the men worked and they had the weight of slavery on their shoulders, the women were the ones who had to face the prospect of, and very often the reality of, losing their children, which is really, really hectic. So that tells us, of course, that the women felt something about the Egyptian exile that was far deeper than what the men felt. Now the thing is this, when we read the Torah, we're not supposed to just read it as an interesting piece of history, something that was significant to the development of our nation. We're supposed to read it as a lesson for us, right now. So it's contemporary, it's 21st century, it's current, and it speaks to us as individuals. So we have to ask ourselves the question, so what do I learn from the story of the women suffering specifically? So let's go back. We said that the big pressure on the women was the fact that their children were being thrown into the Nile. That became like the icon of the cruelty of the Egyptians. There were other ways that they killed the children as well, but the one that kind of represented everything about what Egypt was when they threw the children into the Nile. So we need to analyze that story and understand what's the lesson in that. Why did they throw them into the Nile? I mean, other than the fact that it was practical, because the Nile Delta is so massive, so you effectively have a killing machine that spreads throughout the whole settlement. Everywhere that people lived was in the Nile Delta. So it's easier than dispatching death squads or whatever the case might be. Fine. But the truth of the matter is there are more efficient ways to get rid of people. Because somebody had to throw the baby into the Nile. So why throw the baby into the Nile? If they had to kill the baby, whoever it was that was responsible to throw the babies into the Nile could have just as well have slit their throat, or who knows what, whatever morbid ways they might have had to kill them. Everything in the Torah is highly symbolic, so we need to analyze what's the significance of the Nile in all of this. So it's difficult for us to relate it because we live in the modern world and we have running water. So it's difficult for us to remember that pretty much all ancient civilizations, and even not so ancient, always built themselves around a water source for obvious reasons, because you can't develop human habitat unless you have a water source. So in certain parts of the world where you have good rainfall, maybe it's less of a thing because you can create reservoirs. But in a place like Egypt that really doesn't have much rain, the Nile Delta is the fertile region of the land, and everywhere else is, you're going to have a few nomadic tribes, but you can't really develop human habitat. Now, the nature of the Nile River, again, it's difficult for us to relate to because we don't live in agricultural societies. And, to us, yes, occasionally we have drought warnings and water restrictions, but we don't really relate to the idea that if you live in a river system, and it's a river system that is perennial, so in the season, the river floods. And that's how they irrigated their fields. They lived in the floodplains of the Nile Delta. So in their minds, in their primitive thinking, the Nile was to be worshipped. Because in their primitive thinking, the Nile was a god. Without the Nile, you die. It's as simple as that. If you don't have water, you die. And the only source of drinking water that they had, of course, is from the Nile River. So to them, it was a deity. And that's why the first strike against the Egyptians was dafka, a strike against the Nile, turning the water to blood, because Hashem wanted to show them that it's not a deity, and it's a feature of nature, and I control nature. That was the message. But in the collective thinking of the Egyptian society, they saw the Nile as a god. And the reason they saw it as a god was very simply because if you don't have the Nile, you don't survive. You can't put food on your table, literally. You literally cannot grow wheat or whatever other crops you need. So in terms of concept, so now we know what the Nile was for them. So conceptually then, the Nile represents the things that we believe provide us with our sustenance. So they were primitive, and they looked at the Nile and thought it was a god, And we are more advanced people who live in the modern world. So obviously we would never look at something as a god, but that doesn't mean we don't worship it. It's quite interesting how often you speak to people. I mean, I've definitely had this conversation, and you say, what would you consider to be idolatry in today's world? And very, very often, the first thing that people respond with is the dollar. Worship of money. Now, it may or may not be true. Some people may or may not worship money. But what is true is the same kind of thinking that they had then is very similar to thinking to what we have now. Namely, that there is a system, just like the Nile is this massive river system that provides water to that part of the world. So in our minds, there's a system, and that system flows through our world, and that's how people earn money, and that's how they can put food on their table. So to us, the system is the great economic flow of the world. Then it was a river, and today it's international markets, and it's political sentiment, and it's whether or not people have the confidence to use their money, or if they're stockpiling the money because there's lack of confidence. So there's all these economists who effectively tell us how the flow of the system works. And very much like in biblical terms, where you've got 7 years of famine and 7 years of plenty, there are economists who'll tell you that there are 7-year cycles in world economies, that there are bull markets and bear markets and ups and downs and recessions and recoveries and new innovations, and you have the tech growth and then the tech bubble and the explosion of the tech bubble, all that kind of thing. And basically, you need to respect the system if you wish to be able to make it in this world. That's prevailing modern thinking. Now, the system, it's fairly undeniable, right? So everybody will tell you this is the system and this is how world markets work. Anybody who's honest, though, will also be able to tell you that every once in a while something happens to world markets that nobody saw coming. Because if we all saw it coming, then it wouldn't be as devastating as it turns out when it does come. So as much as we put our faith in the flow of the system, the so-called economic Nile Delta that flows through the whole world, truth of the matter is we don't absolutely control it, and we don't necessarily predict it correctly. So we are kind of at the mercy of the system, and we should recognize that there is a higher authority that actually controls the system. No matter how much we know about economy, no matter how much we know about politics, we don't have to look too far, because we can just look at what's happened in the last year in the world, where nobody in their wildest dreams imagined that we'd be locked down economically because of a pandemic. So there you've got a great example of the fact that Hashem controls it. Now, what happened with Egypt is that Pharaoh had this perspective which says you take young children, you take babies, and you drown them in the Nile. Now, that's also symbolic, right? Because if you drown somebody, that means that they become completely surrounded by and immersed in that particular reality. So Paro's attitude was that from the youngest age, besides the fact that he was actually physically throwing babies into the Nile, but the philosophy of his leadership, which became the philosophy of his country, was that from the youngest age, we have to immerse our children in that headspace. They have to know from the youngest age who to respect and who to deal with in order for them one day to grow up and be successful in their own right. And you immerse them, you drown them, because effectively what happens when you drown somebody in something is that they, as the expression goes, they can't come up for air. They don't have an out. They don't have an alternative. It's what we would call in today's world brainwashing. So you get into somebody's mind and you clarify in their mind that this is the only way to live your life, and they then become trapped inside the system. And that's what Paro wanted. He wanted the people trapped inside the system, where the system doesn't allow you to think independently, and the system doesn't allow you to believe that there's something greater than the system. This is the system, and you're stuck with it. And how do we know it's the system? Because for hundreds of years, our ancestors have lived on this land, and this is how they've survived, only by the Nile River. And by the same token, in today's world, we have people who will tell us exactly the same thing. This is the system. Ever since the Industrial Revolution, this is the system. The system requires the banking, and the system requires saving for a rainy day, and the system requires that you have to get a degree, because if you don't have a degree, you won't be able to get a job, and if you don't get a job, you won't be able to put food on the table. and the system requires that you have to put money aside for a pension and you have to retire at a certain age. Like, there's a very set system. Now, if anybody's honest about it, we can acknowledge that no set system can remain static if the world changes, especially if the world changes dramatically. So we've got, on the one hand, we've got these mega advances in technology and in the global village, but you go to the education system that's supposed to prepare children to go into that world, and it's static. It's fundamentally the same education system that it was 50 years ago in a completely different world without technology. We're still teaching children certain skills that are of absolutely no relevance in today's world, and we're preparing them in school for jobs that are only going to become reality once they're out of school, so they won't necessarily have the right tools. But that's not the concern of the Torah. The Torah's concern is that from the youngest age, we instill in children the belief in the system rather than the belief in Hashem, who is beyond the system, created the people who created the system, and at any given time can change the system. So what's more valuable to give a child at the youngest formative years? Is the most valuable thing to throw them in the river, put them into the stream of education as defined by the secular world, which teaches you a certain set of skills that potentially you could use in a world, assuming the world looks the same after 12 years of schooling as it looked when you entered the school system? Or we should educate, the alternative is we should educate children to have a value system which is absolute, because that will never change, real values, and an awareness of Hashem, and an awareness of the beauty and richness of Torah, which incidentally also has the side benefit of expanding your mind in such a way that you can think out of the box. So if the education system actually fails, then you still know how to think. So which one should we be doing? Egypt was a place that insisted there is only one way, and that is you have to drown the children in the system. And the women, the mothers, the Jewish mothers, that was the thing that pained them the most. It wasn't only about the fact that you're going to throw my child, God forbid, into a death trap. It was about the fact that they cared for the value system. And they cared for the fact that children from the youngest age, if you look through all the history of our people, how many things mothers came up with, lullabies or stories to tell the youngest children, which were all about the value of Torah and about how Hashem is great and so on and so forth. You think back to those Yiddish songs that children grew up with. They're so beautiful, and they're all expressions of faith, and they're all expressions of awareness and connection to Hashem. That's what a mother cares about. And whether she is or isn't conscious of it, the neshama of a Jewish mother is pained at the thought, you're going to take my child and put them through a factory education that's going to deny them consciousness of Hashem. That's the first insight that we have into the translation of the story into a contemporary modern setting. Please God, tomorrow we'll continue to unpack that further.